March 23, 1943. The Tunisian desert shimmered under the cruel sun, a landscape of endless beige and burning silence, broken only by the metallic growl of engines. Inside one of the dust-caked M4 Sherman tanks, Second Lieutenant Frank Red Miller wiped a sleeve across his brow, adjusting the crackling radio knobs. The static hissed like a snake. "Able 6, this is Baker 2, read me?" he said into the handset, voice half swallowed by the roar of his tank's Continental engine. Nothing but a garbled squawk in return. He cursed softly. Outside, the desert wind carried the faint echo of German laughter. Through binoculars on a distant ridge, Wehrmacht officers in their crisp gray uniforms watched the Americans flounder. To them, the Shermans looked like a circus of noise, tanks shouting into boxes while kicking up plumes of dust. "Die Amerikaner, always talking, never fighting," one of them said, grinning. They joked that the Americans could be tracked not by scouts but by radio chatter. What the Germans didn't realize was that those clumsy voices would soon become the most terrifying sound on the battlefield. In the early North African campaigns, the U.S. Army was still learning to fight as a mechanized force. Their tanks were new, their crews untested, their radios often temperamental. Static, crosstalk, even misfires of command, chaos over the airwaves. Yet every Sherman rolled off the line with a radio as standard equipment. No other nation at the time had done that. To the Germans, whose panzer crews often relied on hand signals or colored flags, it seemed foolish, a distraction. They mocked the American habit of talking through their mistakes. But the Americans, born from a culture of innovation and improvisation, were unknowingly nurturing an advantage that would soon transform modern warfare itself. Inside his tank, Miller turned another dial, catching a voice through the noise. "Repeat, enemy armor, grid 9-2, fire mission inbound." He grinned. That was Captain Doyle, somewhere ahead, coordinating artillery support through the same kind of radio that Miller cursed every morning. In the distance, the boom of howitzers answered the call. Columns of black smoke rose over a ridge where German trucks had been parked moments ago. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The Germans, however, didn't see it that way. They had come from a tradition of centralized command, orders handed down in sequence, rigid, disciplined. To them, chaos was death. To the Americans, chaos was the sound of adaptation. Each radio transmission was a thread in a messy, improvised web of coordination. And though it often tangled, it also meant flexibility. A lieutenant like Miller could redirect a platoon on the fly, warn another tank, call in support, or relay enemy movements without waiting for written orders or runners. The first time Miller used his radio to save a life, it was by accident. His gunner, Private Rodriguez, spotted movement through the periscope, two shadows on the flank, crouching with an anti-tank rifle. Miller's instinct wasn't to fire, but to shout into the radio, "Sniper team, left dune." Seconds later, another Sherman swung its turret and erased the threat in a burst of smoke and sand. Miller froze. He hadn't aimed a shot himself, but his words had killed the enemy. It was a strange realization. In this new kind of war, command was as powerful as the gun. By midday, his unit, the 1st Armored Division, was advancing across an open stretch near El Getter. Dust clogged every vent, sweat soaked every uniform, and the radio speakers crackled endlessly. "Baker 2, shift right. Air support inbound. Mark position with smoke." Miller pulled the cord, and a purple plume hissed upward. Minutes later, P-40 Warhawks screamed overhead, strafing the enemy column exactly where the call had directed. Germans scattered for cover, their formation broken. For the first time, Miller understood the true purpose of those boxes of static. They were lifelines. Still, the ridicule persisted. German prisoners captured that week spoke of the noisy Shermans and their endless babble. "Your tanks talk too much," one said, sneering through cracked lips. "We can hear you before we see you." Miller smirked. "Good," he replied. "Means you know what's coming." As the day ended, the desert turned red in the setting sun. Sherman tanks lined the horizon, their silhouettes glowing like embers. Through the open hatch, Miller looked toward the distant hills where German armor had retreated. He could almost hear their frustration carried by the wind. For every insult they hurled at American talking tanks, they were beginning to realize those voices meant coordination, something their own machines lacked. The truth was, the Americans weren't better shots. Their armor wasn't thicker, and their guns weren't stronger. What they had was something invisible yet unstoppable: connection. Each Sherman was a node in an expanding battlefield network. A commander could coordinate 5 tanks, those 5 could reach another 5, and together 30 machines could move as one mind. It wasn't elegance, it was evolution. By nightfall, Miller sat on the hull of his tank, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. He tuned the radio again. Voices murmured, some clear, others faint, scattered across miles of desert. Reports, jokes, coordinates, even someone singing to fill the silence. It was human, it was messy, but it was alive. "You hear that?" Miller said softly to Rodriguez. "That's what winning sounds like." In the German camp miles away, Colonel Heinrich Kruger reviewed the day's losses. The Americans had outmaneuvered them again. He slammed his fist on the map table. "How?" he barked. An aide hesitated before answering. "They communicate, Herr Oberst. Constantly." Kruger's eyes narrowed. "Then we will learn to listen better." He didn't yet realize that listening wasn't enough. The battlefield itself was changing from one of guns and armor to one of information. As Miller drifted to sleep beside his tank, the radio beside him still whispered faint static. He dreamed of home, of quiet, of peace. But the sound followed him, faint and restless, a signal that refused to die. They called it noise. They called it foolishness. They laughed at the idea that a tank could win wars by talking. But history would prove them wrong. The radio wasn't a weakness. It was America's voice, echoing across continents. A symbol of coordination, of democracy, of countless minds thinking as one. And soon, when the Shermans rolled into France, that voice would grow louder. So loud it would drown out the roar of the panzer divisions themselves. They thought our voices would betray us. They never imagined those voices would command a storm. They mocked our chatter, until that chatter turned lethal. A battlefield can be won by bullets, or by voices. The tank that talked became the tank that ruled. The first weeks after El Getter were a lesson in chaos. The Shermans had proven they could talk, but the problem was, they didn't yet know how to listen. Dozens of voices crowded the same frequency. Tank commanders shouting over artillery spotters, infantry sergeants begging for fire support, and radio static drowning half the words before they reached anyone. "It's like fighting in a thunderstorm made of noise," Red Miller grumbled, smacking the side of the radio as if he could knock discipline into the airwaves. Every tank had a voice now, but without order, those voices collided instead of converging. By late April 1943, American commanders realized that their great innovation, the battlefield radio network, was both a miracle and a menace. Reports from Tunisia showed that friendly fire incidents were rising. Air units were bombing marked targets that had moved minutes earlier. Tank platoons broke formation chasing misunderstood orders. "Our strength is talking," General Harmon wrote in a field note, "but our weakness is that everyone talks at once." That truth hung heavy in the heat. To fix it, the Army didn't just need better radios. It needed better communication. That's when the Signal Corps stepped in. Quiet men with clipboards, headphones, and an obsession with clarity. They arrived like teachers to a rowdy classroom, reassigning frequencies, enforcing call signs, and teaching what would soon be called radio discipline. No more full names, no emotional chatter, no stories. Every transmission had to be clear, coded, and brief. It was cold, methodical, like turning chaos into music. Miller sat through the first of those training sessions in a dusty tent near Tebessa. The instructor, a wiry major with a voice like a metronome, paced before a blackboard filled with call sign charts. "You will not say, 'Hey, Joe, where are you?'" he barked. "You will say, 'Able to, report position.' You will not ramble. You will not repeat. You will not let your voice betray fear." He looked around the tent, eyes sharp. "You are not just drivers. You are instruments in an orchestra. The word orchestra stuck with Miller. He began to imagine every tank, every gun, every aircraft as part of a giant composition, the battlefield as a song of steel and static. Each order, each warning, each word had a rhythm. If one voice broke tempo, the harmony fell apart. Weeks later, the desert tested that theory. The Germans had regrouped east of Spitla. Their panzers dug in behind minefields and camouflaged artillery. Patton wanted a breakthrough. The 1st Armored Division, Miller's unit included, would lead the charge. At dawn, a low mist hung over the dunes. Miller climbed into his tank and adjusted his radio to the new frequency assigned that morning, Channel Red. He could hear faint murmurs from other crews checking in. Able 1 ready. Able 2 ready. Baker 1 ready. Then, clear as a bell, came the voice of Captain Doyle. Hold formation until smoke. Then flank left by coordinates. No hero runs today. Keep your heads low and your radios open. When the smoke shells landed, the desert turned white. Miller's tank lurched forward, sand spraying off its treads. The visibility dropped to almost zero. Without the radio, the column would have been blind. But through the static came Doyle's calm voice, guiding them like a beacon. Baker 2, adjust 20 degrees south. Copy 20 south. Baker 3, enemy armor approaching from right ridge, hold and fire. The commands flowed seamlessly, each tank responding in seconds. For the first time, the Americans moved not as scattered machines, but as one breathing creature of steel. Suddenly, a voice cut through the network. Rodriguez in the gunner's seat shouted, "Tank destroyer, 3 o'clock." Miller's heart raced. He grabbed the handset. All Baker units, pan right, fire on flash. The Sherman's cannon thundered, joined instantly by others along the line. Through the smoke, flames erupted from a German Panzer IV, its turret thrown skyward. The entire action, spotting, sharing, firing, took less than 10 seconds. The Germans never saw it coming. By noon, the U.S. column had broken through. Radio discipline had turned noise into precision. Yet, even as victory brewed, the cost was visible. The airwaves carried not just commands, but cries. "We're hit. Engine fire. Loader down." The human side of the network, the fear, the pain, still leaked through. Every death had a voice now, and the survivors had to hear it. Miller sometimes wondered if silence might have been kinder. After the battle, he sat with Doyle outside their tent, both men covered in grime and sweat. Doyle lit a cigarette, exhaled, and said, "You hear what they're saying about us?" Miller looked up. "Who?" "The Germans. They call our tanks ghosts. They say we move faster than their scouts can report." Miller chuckled. "Ghosts, huh? Not bad for a bunch of radio geeks." Doyle smiled faintly. "Don't underestimate geeks. They just won us a desert." Back at headquarters, the success at Spitla caught Patton's attention. He ordered a full expansion of the radio doctrine. Every armored company was to have a trained signal officer. Every tank commander was to memorize brevity codes. What had started as a mocked experiment was now being written into doctrine. The Americans were turning their chatter into a weapon. Still, not everyone believed. Some old-school officers argued radios made men lazy, that real soldiers should rely on instinct, not machines. "You can't replace a commander's eyes with static," Colonel Grayson growled at a briefing. But others countered that the radio didn't replace the commander. It amplified him. The debate became a quiet war inside the war itself. Tradition versus transformation. Then came the night that silenced the doubters. A convoy of Shermans was ambushed near Mackenzie Pass, pinned by hidden anti-tank guns. For half an hour, they were trapped, until a single radio transmission from a downed scout plane changed everything. "Panzer battery on ridge, grid 748. The call was relayed through 5 tanks in 30 seconds. Within minutes, artillery zeroed in. The ridge exploded in fire. The trapped column escaped. When the survivors rolled back to camp, the first thing they did wasn't reload. They replaced burned-out radios. The machines had saved them. No one laughed at static anymore. That night, Miller sat beside the glowing tubes of his set, listening to faint transmissions from miles away. voices of men he'd never met, yet felt connected to. The war was no longer a map of positions. It was a web of signals, pulsing like veins. He realized that the radio was more than a tool. It was trust made audible. By the summer of '43, American tankers spoke a new language, short, clipped, precise. A few words could move an entire battalion. Fox 1 pivot. Smoke on ridge. Angels inbound. It wasn't just talk anymore. It was control, coordination, and speed. The once clumsy chatter had become a code of survival. And yet, in quiet moments, Miller missed the early days, the messy humanity of those first battles when everyone shouted, laughed, and swore over the air. Now, every word was engineered, every pause measured. War had turned communication into science. But deep down, he knew that discipline was the only way forward. The next campaign loomed, Italy. Rumor said the terrain there would eat tanks alive. Miller looked at his radio and smiled grimly. "Guess it's up to us to make the mountains talk," he said. Somewhere across the sea, German engineers were already studying captured Sherman radios, trying to copy them. But what they couldn't replicate was the thing inside, the shared instinct that every American tanker now carried. The belief that a voice, clear and true, could change the tide of battle. From that day, the Germans learned to fear the silence, because when the radio stopped talking, it meant the Shermans were already behind them. June 10, 1944. Normandy was a thunderstorm of metal. The air vibrated with engines, gunfire, and the endless murmur of radio voices. Dawn light spilled across the French hedgerows as hundreds of Sherman tanks rolled through the mist, their antennas whipping in the wind like black reeds. Red Miller, now a seasoned lieutenant, listened to the symphony in his headset. A dozen voices layered across frequencies. Alpha 3, shift west. Infantry on your left, hold fire. Air strike incoming, mark with smoke. Each command landed like a note in a deadly orchestra. This wasn't the clumsy chatter of Tunisia. This was precision, coordination, power. To the Germans watching from their ruined bunkers, it looked unreal. An enemy that moved like water, flowing around defenses, striking from angles no one could predict. Wehrmacht officers barked orders over field telephones that lagged minutes behind. By the time a panzer commander received an update, his position was already surrounded. "They move as if one mind commands them all," a captured German would later say, shaking his head in disbelief. The secret was no longer a secret. Every Sherman was part of a vast, invisible web radio-linked to platoons, artillery, aircraft, and even naval guns offshore. When one tank saw the enemy, every nearby unit knew within seconds. Miller could call a strike without even seeing the target. He'd simply transmit coordinates, and the sky would answer. The Germans had Tigers, massive, terrifying beasts of armor, but they hunted alone. The Shermans hunted in packs. As Miller's column advanced inland from Omaha Beach, the fields erupted with life. Birds scattered, smoke drifted, and the ground quaked with treads. "Panther at 11 o'clock. Rodriguez shouted from the gunner's seat. Miller didn't hesitate. "Echo platoon. Bearing 11, fire and fade." He switched channels. "Air command, target mark red smoke. Repeat red smoke." Within moments, a P-47 Thunderbolt screamed overhead, dropping ordnance that blasted the German tank into a pillar of flame. The coordination took less than 40 seconds. Before the Germans even knew where the fire had come from, their armor was gone. Behind the front line, a network of signal trucks hummed like the nervous system of a giant organism. Operators sat with headphones, mapping voices to movements. Each tank's report fed into a live mosaic of the battle. For the first time in military history, war was being fought through information faster than bullets. Miller didn't see it as theory, he lived it. "Command through chaos," he called it. By the time the Americans reached St. Lo, their momentum was unstoppable. The Shermans didn't just fight, they conducted. When one platoon engaged, another flanked, and a third cut off escape routes. "It's like they can see through the smoke," a German tank ace muttered, watching his comrades burn. The truth was simpler. They could hear through it. Statistics told the same story. In early Normandy operations, radio-equipped U.S. units achieved a 30% faster reaction time than comparable Axis forces. But numbers couldn't capture what it felt like inside the tanks, the eerie sense of unity. Miller described it in a letter home. "It's strange, Ma. I can't see half the men I'm fighting with, but I know they're there. When I talk, someone miles away hears me, and we move like one body. Feels like we're part of something bigger than the tank, bigger than us." Still, the Germans weren't fools. They adapted, deploying jammers and intercept teams. Some began to mimic American voices, spreading false commands. The Americans countered with call-and-response codes, authentication tones, and frequency hops. The radio war became a duel of wits as much as firepower. Miller once caught a fake order, "Pull back, Baker Company." But the voice lacked the clipped rhythm of trained command. He ignored it, pushed forward, and captured the position. Later, they found a dead German operator clutching an American handset. The battle for the airwaves was as real as the one on the ground. In September 1944 came the test that would define the legend, the Battle of Aricourt. Fog rolled over the French countryside like a curtain, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The Germans sent dozens of Panthers to crush what they thought was a small American patrol. What they didn't know was that Miller's battalion was listening. Through the mist, radar and radio triangulation gave away the enemy's every move. Miller's voice was calm over the net. "Hold positions. Fire by echo." The Shermans lay in wait, hidden behind hedgerows. When the first Panthers appeared, their massive guns blazing, the Americans didn't panic. Miller's voice cut through the static. "Shift left, Baker 2. Smoke out front. Fire for range." One by one, the Shermans coordinated blind shots guided by radio spotting. Explosions lit the fog from within like flashes of lightning. In less than an hour, 5 Shermans had destroyed more than a dozen German tanks, without ever seeing them clearly. Word spread like wildfire through both armies. German prisoners whispered about the talking ghosts, tanks that seemed to strike from nowhere. Their own radios, often limited to commanders, couldn't match the web of communication that linked every Sherman crew. One officer, interrogated later, admitted bitterly, "Your radios make you fight faster than we can think." That was the turning of the tide. The battlefield had become an ecosystem of signals, and the Americans ruled it. Commanders learned to think in networks rather than units. Air controllers synced with artillery through the same channels as tank crews. Even medics used radios to navigate through minefields to reach the wounded. What began as a mocked gadget had evolved into the heart of Allied warfare. For the men inside the Shermans, it was both empowering and terrifying. There was no isolation anymore. Every decision echoed instantly across dozens of ears. Mistakes were public, triumphs shared. Once, Miller ordered a smoke barrage too early, blinding friendly infantry. The reprimand came not in paperwork, but in silence, the brief pause of trust broken over the air. He never made that mistake again. As autumn arrived, the Shermans advanced into Lorraine. Rain turned the ground to sludge, but the network held firm. "Even the mud can't stop the signal," Rodriguez joked, tapping the radio with affection. The tanks rolled on, guided by invisible threads of coordination. When German ambushes hit, counterfire came in seconds. When artillery screamed overhead, spotters relayed corrections faster than the shells could fall. By now, even German intelligence officers wrote reports acknowledging the transformation. One note intercepted by Allied HQ read, "The American armored forces display an uncanny unity. Their machines appear to anticipate one another. Engagements are decided before they begin." At dusk, after one brutal day of fighting near Nancy, Miller stood beside his tank watching the horizon. The air still buzzed with faint radio hum, an endless heartbeat of communication. He realized that this was what real command felt like. Not shouting orders from above, but hearing, responding, and moving as part of something vast. He thought back to Tunisia, the laughter of German officers who had mocked the Americans' noisy tanks. Now, those same voices were silent, buried beneath the very system they had ridiculed. The irony wasn't lost on him. When he climbed back into his tank that night, he tuned the dial one last time. The net was alive with chatter, crews reporting, coordinating, surviving. Miller smiled faintly and said to no one in particular, "They laughed at our radios. Now they'd give anything to have one." The laughter had stopped. In its place, only the static of surrender. The war's end came not with a shout, but with a faint hum over the airwaves. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany, the radios that once carried the sound of fear and fury now crackled with messages of surrender. Static filled the spaces where chaos used to live. The men who had once fought through fire and dust now listened to silence, unsure what to do without the voices that had guided them through years of war. For Lieutenant Frank "Red" Miller, the silence was almost unbearable. He sat in his Sherman, engine off, headset resting around his neck, listening to the faint hiss of the network that had once commanded entire armies. Now it was just ghosts, faint echoes of coordinates, names, and laughter lost in the static. The final push into Germany had shown the full maturity of the machine that had begun as chaos in the desert. The Sherman's radio, once mocked as a gimmick, had become the nervous system of the Allied war machine. What started as a single voice shouting through static in Tunisia had grown into a vast architecture of coordination. Infantry, armor, artillery, and aircraft all united by invisible threads of signal. The result was overwhelming. German units, scattered and blind, crumbled under the precision of American command. In one engagement near the Ruhr, the U.S. 3rd Armored Division coordinated over 400 tanks and vehicles through a single command frequency, directing movement, fire, and supply lines in real time. The battlefield had become something new, a living grid of communication. But even as the system triumphed, it revealed its human cost. Men no longer fought alone. Every word spoken on the radio was recorded in memory, every mistake heard by dozens. The battlefield had turned intimate. Miller remembered the last voice of Sergeant Rodriguez, calling through smoke after a shell hit his tank. "We're hit. Baker 2. Engine's gone. Tell the others we'll hold." The words lingered in Miller's head long after the line went dead. Radios gave life to the battlefield, but they also made death louder. When the German surrender finally came, Miller and his crew were stationed near a small Bavarian town. The order arrived not by courier, not by trumpet, but by radio. A calm voice read the message across every channel. "All hostilities cease at 2301 hours Central European Time." No cheering, no gunfire in celebration. Just a wave of stillness that swept across Europe. The air was filled with quiet. Miller sat there for a long time, staring at the radio that had been both weapon and companion. "Guess that's it," he said softly. The tank that talked finally ran out of things to say. In the months that followed, the world tried to understand what had changed. Generals wrote books about the triumph of industry and tactics, but few grasped that it was communication, not armor or firepower, that had reshaped the art of war. For the first time, armies had fought not as separate units, but as synchronized systems. Information had become as valuable as ammunition. The laughter of those who once mocked the talking tanks had faded into the history books, replaced by awe and imitation. Within a few years, every major military on Earth would adopt the same doctrine. Radios in every vehicle, every squad, every command post. Miller was sent home in late 1945, the war behind him but the sound of static still in his dreams. He found peace hard to adjust to. Civilians spoke face to face. He found himself waiting for transmission delays that never came. One night, his wife found him sitting in the garage, tuning a small ham radio, listening to faraway voices from across the Atlantic. "You miss it, don't you?" she asked. He smiled faintly. Not the fighting, just the connection. He had realized something few others did, that in those years of destruction, men had built not just machines of war, but a new way of linking human minds under pressure. Historians would later call it the birth of the information battlefield. The same principles that allowed Sherman tanks to outmaneuver panzers would evolve into Cold War radar networks, missile guidance systems, and eventually digital command grids. The voice had become the foundation of a new age of warfare, one where coordination, data, and precision outweighed brute strength. The radio inside a Sherman tank had been the ancestor of satellites, drones, and global command systems yet to come. In post-war Germany, captured officers gave their own reflections. One, Colonel Kruger, the same man who had once mocked the talking Americans in Tunisia, confessed in an interrogation, "We had better tanks, better guns, better training. But they were united. We were not. Their radios turned every man into a commander." The irony was bitter. The Germans had built weapons of steel, the Americans had built weapons of communication. In 1946, the U.S. Army Signal Corps published a report noting that by the end of the war, over 150,000 radio sets had been installed in tanks, trucks, and aircraft, more than all other nations combined. It concluded that no mechanical weapon, no tactical maneuver, would have succeeded without this web of voice and signal. The battlefield had spoken, and the world had listened. Years later, at a reunion of veterans, Miller met some of the men who had fought beside him through North Africa, Italy, and France. Their hair was gray now, their faces lined. But when someone brought out an old Air 508 radio set and turned the dial, the room fell silent. A faint hiss filled the air, and suddenly they were all back there. In the desert, in the mud, in the smoke. Listening for orders, for warnings, for hope. "You remember what they used to say about us?" Rodriguez's old replacement chuckled. "That we talked too much." Miller grinned. "Yeah," he said. "And that's why we won." Outside, the world had moved on. Tanks were faster, sleeker, armed with computers instead of hand-cranked radios. But the principle was the same. Speak, listen, coordinate, survive. The soul of the Sherman lived on. Not in its armor, not in its gun, but in its voice. And that was the true irony. The Germans had laughed at the Americans' noise, thinking silence meant discipline and strength. Yet it was the noise, the messy human chatter, that brought victory. The world had learned a lesson written not in books, but in static. Unity was louder than pride. Miller's grandson would later become a communications officer in Vietnam, operating radios light years more advanced than the ones in the Sherman. Before his deployment, Miller handed him a small, battered handset from his old tank. "It's not the machine that matters," he told him. "It's the connection it carries. Never forget that." The boy nodded, not yet understanding, but years later he would. As history turned, new generations would find the same pattern repeating. New tools mocked, new technologies dismissed, until their power reshaped everything. The world had laughed at the Sherman's radio just as it once laughed at the airplane, the tank, the computer, and the satellite. But every great leap forward begins as a joke before it becomes destiny. "They laughed at our radios," Miller said once during a television interview in 1963, his voice calm, eyes distant. "Now every army, every nation, every soldier carries one. I guess we taught the world to listen." The interviewer asked him what he thought the next revolution in warfare would be. Miller looked down at his hands, then smiled slightly. "The next war won't be fought by who shouts the loudest," he said. "It'll be won by who listens the best." He paused, as if hearing something distant, something only he could catch. A faint echo of static from decades past. The same hum that had followed him from the desert to Normandy to home. "They thought our voices would betray us," he murmured softly. "But it was our voices that saved us." And in that moment, the air seemed to vibrate again. Not with engines or artillery, but with memory. The tank that talked had gone silent, but its echo still commanded the battlefield of history. They laughed at the radios once. Now the entire world speaks through them. Every victory begins with a voice. Which modern machine, he wondered, will repeat this story next?